Welcome back, and if this is your first time here, hello, come in, the fire's already going. Settle into whatever you're settling into tonight. Get the blanket situated the way you like it, let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been living all day, and let me do the rest of the work for a while. Tonight we are going somewhere strange and warm and very long ago, into the tangled business of how medieval people actually got married, which turns out to be far weirder than the tapestries let on. If you enjoy these, and only if you genuinely do, a like helps the channel more than you'd think, and subscribing means the next one finds you on some future sleepless night. And before we go, tell me where you're listening from. I love scrolling those comments and finding one person in a city 8 time zones from the last one, all of us awake in the same quiet. Now, let's talk about the single most radical idea the medieval church ever had, which is that a marriage belonged to nobody but the two people making it. Here is the rule, and I want you to sit with how strange it is. By the 12th century, the settled position of the Western Church, hammered out by canon lawyers and theologians and finally locked into place under Pope Alexander III, who reigned from 1159 to 1181, was that a valid, binding, indissoluble marriage required exactly one thing: the free consent of the two people involved, exchanged in the present tense. That was it. Not a priest, not a church, not a witness, not a parent, not a ring, not a contract, not a single drop of holy water. If a man and a woman of age said to each other, "I take you as my wife and I take you as my husband," the words the lawyers called verba de presenti, words of the present, they were, at that instant, as married as any king and queen crowned in a cathedral. The theologian Peter Lombard had argued exactly this in the mid-1100s, and the church remarkably agreed with him. It was the consent that made the marriage, not the ceremony. Which means the medieval church, an institution not otherwise famous for trusting ordinary people with anything, quietly built the entire edifice of Christian marriage on the one thing it could not control: 2 individuals opening their mouths and meaning it. Now think about what that actually did in practice, because the theologians clearly did not think hard enough about it. It meant that any 2 people, anywhere, at any moment, could marry themselves, behind a barn, in a field, leaning over a tavern table, in a doorway during a rainstorm with no one watching but a bored dog. There was no minimum venue. The sacrament didn't need a building any more than a promise needs a notary. It just needed the words and the will. And so the medieval countryside was, legally speaking, a minefield of accidental spouses, because a valid marriage could happen faster and more quietly than almost any other binding act a person could perform. You could not sell a cow that easily. Transferring a strip of land took witnesses, seals, a lord's court, and often a written charter. Transferring your entire marital future took a sentence and a pulse. And it gets better, or worse, depending on whether you're the one explaining it to your parents. The church drew a fine and, to modern ears, genuinely funny distinction between 2 tenses. Words of the present, de presenti, married you on the spot. I take you meant done, sealed, forever. But words of the future, de futuro. I will take you, I promise to marry you. Created only a betrothal, a binding engagement, but not yet a marriage. Fine so far. Except the lawyers added a twist that turned the whole thing into a trap. A de futuro promise, a mere engagement, was automatically converted into a full, indissoluble marriage the moment the couple had sex. The logic was that sleeping together demonstrated present consent. The deed spoke the vow the mouth had only future tensed. So I promise I'll marry you someday, plus 1 week evening equalled, in the eyes of God and the ecclesiastical courts, a wedding. No takebacks, no cathedral, no idea it had even happened until a church court explained it to you months later. You can already see the chaos assembling itself, and the court records prove it wasn't hypothetical. The consistory courts of medieval England, the church tribunals that handled marriage disputes, are stuffed with cases that boil down to 2 people disagreeing violently about whether a marriage had accidentally occurred. The surviving records from the Diocese of Ely and the extraordinary 14th century Act Book from the Church Court of York give us case after case of exactly this. Someone would sue to enforce a marriage the other person swore had never happened. A woman would haul a man before the court, insisting that the words he'd muttered while courting her, or the promise he'd made right before the part he definitely remembered, had bound him for life. Witnesses would be dragged in to testify about what precisely was said in a garden, in a kitchen, over a cup of ale, and in what tents. Church courts across Europe found themselves in the deeply undignified position of passing the exact grammar of pillow talk, because on the difference between I take and I will take hung the entire legal validity of a human being's marriage. The evidentiary problems here are frankly spectacular. Consent-based marriage is beautifully humane in principle, and a total disaster in an era before recording devices. How do you prove what two people said to each other when the whole point was that no priest and no witness had to be present? Often you couldn't. The York Cause papers include men flatly denying they'd ever spoken the binding words, and women producing friends, neighbours, and the occasional startled bystander to swear they'd overheard it. In one strand of these cases you get the medieval equivalent of a contract dispute where the contract was verbal, unwitnessed, and one party now has an excellent reason to have forgotten it. The court's job was to sift the tenses out of memory and self-interest, which is roughly like asking a modern judge to rule on whether you technically agreed to the terms and conditions you scrolled past at 2 a.m. And into that gap poured the professional temptation, because where there is ambiguity, there is opportunity. The system practically invented a category of person the sources delicately worried about, the seducer who understood the loophole. If a valid marriage could be conjured from a private promise followed by consummation, then a man who wanted to get a reluctant woman into bed had a script. Promise marriage, de futuro, casually, privately, deniably. And the consummation would either bind him or, more likely if he was the sort of man who knew the trick, be something he could later swear had followed no promise at all. Moralists thundered about it. Church courts saw the wreckage. The very rule designed to protect a couple's freedom to choose each other became, in the wrong hands, a tool for manufacturing consent that was never really there. The church had built a lock that opened with a whisper, and then acted surprised that whisperers showed up. The families, meanwhile, absolutely hated all of this, and here's the part I find genuinely delightful. For most of human history and across most of medieval society, marriage was a treaty. It merged bloodlines, moved land, sealed alliances, settled feuds, and determined who inherited what for 3 generations. Parents, lords, and kin groups had spent centuries treating a child's marriage as far too important to leave to the child, and the church, the same church deeply entangled with those same noble families, had just declared, as a matter of binding sacramental law, that none of them got a vote. A daughter could ruin a carefully negotiated dynastic marriage by whispering the present tense to a stable boy, and if she'd meant it, it counted. There was, technically, nothing the family could do afterward, because the marriage was already sacramentally complete, and the church would not dissolve it. Imagine spending 2 years and a small fortune negotiating a merger, and losing the whole thing because your daughter said 8 words to the help. So the powerful did what the powerful always do when a rule inconveniences them. They built an entire counter-industry to manage the risk. Great families guarded their marriageable children like assets, which they were, and pushed hard for betrothals arranged early and witnessed heavily. The church, for its part, developed the reading of the banns, the public announcement of an intended marriage on 3 successive Sundays, precisely to drag these dangerously private unions out into the daylight where objections could surface before it was too late. That machinery got formalised at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which strongly encouraged public, announced, witnessed weddings and frowned on the secret kind. But, and this is the crucial, almost comic point, the council did not make the secret ones invalid. It made them illicit. It made them punishable. It made them a sin and an irregularity for which you could be fined or shamed. It just couldn't make them not count. 2 people who married themselves in a hedgerow against every rule and wish of their families were doing something forbidden, scandalous, and completely, permanently binding all at once. The church had painted itself into a theological corner. It had decided consent made the sacrament, and it could not then undecide it just because the consent was wildly inconvenient. This tension between the radical private freedom the church had enshrined and the very public control everyone actually wanted ran unresolved for centuries. It wasn't truly settled in Catholic lands until the Council of Trent, and specifically the decree known as Temezi in 1563, which finally declared that a marriage was only valid if celebrated before a parish priest and witnesses. That's 400 years after Alexander III, 4 centuries in which the official enforceable law of Christendom was that you could marry a person your family had never met, in a place with no roof, in front of no one, and the most powerful institution in Europe would back you to the hilt while privately wishing you hadn't. Trent slammed the loophole shut. But it's worth remembering how long it stayed open, and how strange it is that the medieval church, feudal, hierarchical, suspicious of the individual in nearly every other domain, was, on this one enormous question of who you got to spend your life with, more radical than a great many societies that came after it. I think that's the thing that stays with me about all of this. We tell ourselves the Middle Ages were the age of the arranged marriage, the era when a woman was handed from father to husband like a sealed jar, and in daily brutal practice that was often exactly how it went. But the law underneath it, and the actual theology the whole civilization claimed to believe, said something almost defiantly different, that the marriage was not the father's to give or the lord's to arrange, but the couple's alone to make, with nothing but their own two voices. It was a beautiful, humane, wildly impractical idea, and they built the loophole first and spent the next 400 years trying to figure out how to live with it. Chapter 2. The wedding at the church door. Picture the church, but don't go inside yet. That's the whole point. When two medieval people got married in the ordinary, proper, above-board way, the way their families wanted and the priest approved of, the ceremony did not happen at the altar. It happened outside, on the porch, at the great western doors, with the couple standing on the threshold, and the congregation and the curious spilling out into the churchyard behind them. The Latin phrase for it turns up again and again in the records, in facie ecclesiae, in the face of the church, and often more literally ad ostium ecclesiae, at the door of the church. The vows, the ring, the handing over of the bride, the public declaration, all of it took place on the steps, in the open air, before you ever crossed into consecrated ground. Only afterward did the wedding party file inside for the nuptial mass and the blessing. The most important part of your wedding was structurally the part performed on the front stoop. And there's a reason for that geography, one that tells you almost everything about what a medieval wedding actually was. The porch was the public, legal, worldly forum. The interior was the sacred one. What happened at the door was the business, the contract, the property, the consent, the transfer of a woman from one household to another with all the money and land that moved with her. And the medieval mind quite sensibly did not think that belonged at the altar. The altar was for the sacrament, the mass, the blessing that came after the deal was struck. So the couple negotiated their entire earthly future on the threshold, and only then stepped inside to have God sign off on it. It was, in the most literal architectural sense, a closing performed on the front steps, with the sanctuary functioning as the notary you visited afterward to make it official. We know an enormous amount about how this actually went because of the Sarum rite, the use of Salisbury, the dominant form of the liturgy across late medieval England, whose marriage service survives in detail and whose bones you would recognise instantly. That famous string of vows, and to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, comes down to us essentially from this rite, spoken in English even when the rest of the service was in Latin, because the whole point of the vows was that the couple and the crowd had to understand them, and the Sarum bride's vow included a line that got quietly dropped from later versions, in which she promised to be bonaire and buxom in bed and at board, which meant gentle and obedient at the bedside and at the table, board being the table, the same board you get in room and board. The word buxom has since drifted a very long way from obedient, but in the 14th century a bride was promising compliance, not a figure, and she was promising it on the church porch in front of the neighbours. Then there was the ring, and the ring had its own small choreography that people took seriously. In the Sarum rite, the groom placed the ring first on the bride's thumb, then the first finger, then the second, naming the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, before finally settling it on the fourth finger, where it stayed. The fourth finger of the left hand was chosen on the strength of a genuinely old and genuinely wrong piece of anatomy. The belief, inherited from Roman writers and repeated cheerfully all through the Middle Ages, that a particular vein, the vena amoris, the vein of love, ran directly from that finger to the heart. There is no such vein. The finger connects to the heart exactly as much as every other finger does, which is to say by the ordinary circulatory system that connects everything to everything. But the whole of medieval and modern Europe put the wedding ring there anyway, and still does, on the authority of an anatomical claim that was already centuries out of date when the priest first said it on the porch. A small monument to the fact that a good story about the body will outlive the facts about it every single time. The ring wasn't the only thing that changed hands, and this is where the porch reveals its true nature as a marketplace. At the church door, the groom typically laid out coins and sometimes a ring or a token on a book or a small dish or a shield. The douce, the dower, the provision the man pledged for the woman's support if she outlived him. In some rites he spoke the endowment plainly. With this ring I thee wed, and with my body I thee honour, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. That worldly goods clause is not poetry. It was a real public declaration of property settlement, spoken aloud on the steps precisely so that the assembled witnesses would remember it if there was ever a fight about what the widow was owed. You were not just exchanging affection on that porch, you were announcing, before legally useful onlookers, the financial terms of the entire arrangement, which is a strange thing to do in a wedding dress and a very sensible thing to do before there were filing cabinets. The witnesses, in fact, were the entire reason for the open-air staging, and here the whole system connects back to the mess we spent the last chapter untangling. Remember the problem. The church had ruled that consent alone made a marriage, which meant valid marriages could happen in secret and then be denied, disputed, or forgotten. The wedding at the church door was the cure. By dragging the vows out onto the porch, in daylight, before the assembled parish, the church converted a private act into a public event, with a crowd of living witnesses who could later swear in court that yes, they saw it, they heard the words, they watched the ring go on the fourth finger and the coins go onto the book. A marriage in facie ecclesiae was armoured against exactly the kind of he-said-she-said catastrophe that clogged the consistory courts because half the village had watched it happen. The porch wasn't ceremony for ceremony's sake, it was evidence generated in advance, stored in the memories of everyone who came for the free food afterward. And the priest's role in all this was smaller and stranger than you'd expect, which is worth sitting with for a moment. He was not, in the medieval theology, the man who made the marriage. The couple made it themselves with their own consent, exactly as the last chapter's canon lawyers insisted. The priest presided, he witnessed, he blessed. He lent the whole thing the weight and endorsement of the institution, and he could refuse to do the honours if the banns hadn't been read or something looked wrong. But sacramentally, the priest at a medieval wedding was closer to the most important guest than to the officiant in the modern sense. The couple were the ministers of their own sacrament. The clergyman was there to make it public, proper, and blessed. So the man in the vestments on the porch mattered enormously in practice, and technically almost not at all in essence. A distinction that would have meant nothing to a nervous bride and everything to a canon lawyer. The whole affair also had a running order that placed the human transaction before the divine one, in a way that can feel backwards until you understand the logic. First at the door came the questioning, the priest asking whether either party knew of any impediment, the same instinct that survives in the "speak now or forever hold your peace" line, and the exchange of consent and the vows and the ring and the endowment. That was the marriage. Then and only then the doors opened and the party moved inside for the nuptial mass, where a further blessing was pronounced over the couple, sometimes with a care cloth, a canopy or veil held over them as they knelt. So the sequence went: settle the legal reality on the porch, then walk into the sacred space to have it sanctified. The medieval wedding physically separated the deal from the blessing, and did them in that order, which is a startlingly clear-eyed piece of stagecraft for a culture we like to imagine as swimming in incense and ignoring the fine print. There's a class dimension to the porch too, because the doorway didn't treat everyone the same. For the great and the grand, the church door could mean the west front of a cathedral, a spectacular public stage for a dynastic union that half a county had come to witness. For ordinary villagers, it meant the humble porch of the parish church, the same porch that on other days sheltered people from rain and hosted bits of parish business and occasionally a bit of trade. The porch was genuinely a semi-public civic space, a threshold in the social sense as much as the architectural one, and marriages fit naturally there precisely because they were half-worldly, half-holy events that belonged neither fully out in the marketplace nor fully in at the altar. The medieval church porch was the in-between room of the whole community, and a wedding was the most in-between thing that ever happened in a person's life. One of the most famous marriages in all of medieval literature happens exactly here, and it's worth knowing that Chaucer's audience would have caught the joke instantly. The wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales boasts of having had 5 husbands, 5, all married as she says at the church door. "Whose bonde at church door I have had 5, she declares, and the line is a flex because being married at the church door was the mark of a properly, publicly, legitimately wedded woman, not a woman who'd cohabited or eloped or gotten herself entangled in some ambiguous private promise. She's not bragging about romance, she's bragging about paperwork. 5 times she stood on the porch, 5 times the banns were read, and the vows were public and the endowment was announced. 5 times she came away, a legally armoured widow with a claim on the dower. The church door in that line is a status symbol, the medieval equivalent of saying you were married in a real venue with a real licence and real signatures, 5 separate times, and outlived them all. By the later Middle Ages, the whole ceremony gradually migrated indoors, and eventually the porch wedding faded into history and then into costume drama. But its logic never really left us. The vows we still recite, the ring on the 4th finger, the public, if anyone objects, speak now, the announcement before witnesses, all of it is the porch, folded up and carried inside and set down again near the altar, its origins forgotten by nearly everyone who repeats it. We kept the script and lost the stage directions, and so the next time you picture a medieval wedding as a candlelit scene deep inside some dim stone nave, remember that the real thing, the vows, the ring, the money, the promise to be gentle at bed and board, happened out front in the weather on the steps in the face of the church and the full view of the neighbours, because a marriage was a public fact before it was ever a private feeling, and the medieval world built its front door to prove it. Chapter 3. Betrothing the Cradle. Here is a sentence that was legally coherent in the Middle Ages and would end a modern life. A 7-year-old could be betrothed, not married quite. We'll get to that distinction, because the church cared about it enormously, but formally, bindingly promised, entered into a betrothal that the canon lawyers recognised and enforced. The age of 7 was the threshold the church drew for a valid future promise of marriage, on the reasoning that 7 was roughly the age of reason, the age at which a child could understand a promise well enough to make one. So across medieval Europe, children who had recently learned to talk were being solemnly engaged to other children, their tiny consents recorded, their futures pledged, while the adults in the room treated the whole thing as the serious dynastic business it actually was. The kids, presumably, wanted to go play. The distinction the church clung to matters, so let me lay it out clearly, because it's the hinge the entire absurd machinery turns on. Betrothal, the de futuro promise, I will marry you, could be contracted at 7. Actual marriage, the binding de presenti present tense vow that we met 2 chapters ago, could not be validly completed until the canonical ages of consent, which the church fixed at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Those numbers weren't arbitrary. They tracked the medieval understanding of the onset of puberty, the point at which a marriage could in principle be consummated, and thus become a real, indissoluble sacrament. So the system had 2 gates. At 7 you could be promised, and at 12 or 14 you could actually be married, and the years in between were a strange legal limbo where a child was spoken for but not yet bound, engaged to a person they might barely know for a wedding that might never happen, and the crucial, almost merciful catch, the pressure valve the whole thing depended on, and was this. A betrothal contracted in childhood could be repudiated when the child reached the age of consent. When the girl turned 12 or the boy turned 14, they were supposed to have a genuine choice. They could affirm the childhood promise and turn it into a real marriage, or they could refuse it and walk away, and the church, holding hard to its principle that consent alone makes a marriage, backed the refusal. The canon lawyers built this off-ramp precisely because they knew a promise made by a 7-year-old wasn't really the 7-year-old's promise at all, it was the parents', and their whole theology insisted the marriage had to belong to the couple. So the law said, in effect, your family may promise you at 7, but at 12 the choice becomes yours, and if you say no, no it is. You will not be shocked to learn that the families did not love handing that choice back, and the records show them working very hard to make the choice a formality. The whole point of a childhood betrothal, from the family's side, was to lock in an advantageous match early, to secure the land, the alliance, the heir, the merger, before some rival family or, God forbid, the child's own future feelings got in the way. A betrothal signed when the parties were toddlers was a way of reaching forward in time and pre-committing the marriage market years before the goods were, so to speak, mature. And so the years between betrothal and marriageable age were often spent making the eventual free consent as inevitable as possible, raising the children together, keeping them entangled, applying every ounce of familial pressure so that when the girl turned 12 and was formally asked whether she consented, saying no would mean defying everyone who had fed and housed and arranged her entire short life. The freedom was real in law. It was frequently theatrical in practice. But here is the delightful thing. It was not always theatrical, and the court records prove that some of these children grew up and used the off-ramp with gusto. The Church Court of York, that same extraordinary 14th century archive we keep returning to, preserves cases of young people hauling their childhood betrothals into court to be dissolved, standing up and testifying that no, they had never really consented, that the promise had been made over their heads when they were too young to mean it, that they refused now that the choice was theirs. There are cases of couples married as children who reached the age of reason and flatly repudiated each other, and the court, following its own logic, let them. The whole apparatus that let parents betroth a 7-year-old also, by its own internal rules, handed that child a legal crowbar to pry the arrangement apart later, and some of them swung it. The most famous and best documented of these grew out of a specific corner of England and a specific historian's obsession, and it's worth telling because the details are so vivid. In 1561, just past our medieval window, but drawing on unbroken medieval practice, the Diocese of Chester recorded a run of cases about exactly these child marriages, later made famous by the antiquarian Frederick Furnivall in a Victorian collection with the irresistible title Child Marriages, Divorces and Ratifications. The testimony in those records is extraordinary and human in a way that dry law never is. One boy remembered being married at around 11 or 12 and being unable to eat his supper afterward out of misery. Adults remembered having to be coaxed, bribed, or physically led through the vows. Couples described being put to bed together as children and simply going to sleep, and then years later coming to court to dissolve the whole thing on the grounds that they had never truly consented and had never willingly consummated it. These are not abstractions, they are people, decades later, remembering the strange grown-up ritual that had been performed on them before they were old enough to want it, and asking a court to let them out. The reasons families reached for cradle betrothals in the first place ran the full range from cold dynastic calculation to something almost tender, and the calculation end is genuinely startling. Among the great and titled, a child betrothal could seal a peace between warring houses, secure a claim to a throne, or attach a small heir to a large fortune before anyone could counterbid. Wardship made this even sharper. If a nobleman died leaving a young heir, that heir, and crucially the right to arrange the heir's marriage, became a valuable asset that could be granted, sold, or fought over by the crown and its favourites. A wealthy orphan's marriage was quite literally a commodity, and betrothing the child early was a way of cashing in the asset before some rival got their hands on the wardship. The medieval marriage market didn't just tolerate marrying off children. In its upper reaches it treated a well-connected minor as a financial instrument with a face. At the very top the stakes turned children into pieces on the diplomatic board, and the sources are full of tiny brides and grooms crossing borders to seal treaties. Royal and noble children were betrothed across kingdoms for reasons that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with alliances between crowns, dowries measured in provinces, and peace treaties that needed a marriage to seal them. A princess might be promised in infancy to a foreign prince, shipped off to be raised at his court so she'd be fluent in the language and loyal to the household by the time she was old enough to marry. Pre-installed, essentially, like software loaded before the hardware ships. The child's own preferences didn't enter the negotiation because the child wasn't the party to it. 2 kingdoms were, and the child was the clause that bound them. It's dynastic politics conducted through the bodies of people too young to read the treaty they'd become. The Church, to its enduring credit, was genuinely uncomfortable with a lot of this, and its discomfort shows in the very rules it kept insisting on. Every mechanism we've discussed, the age of reason at 7, the age of consent at 12 and 14, the right of repudiation, the insistence that real marriage required real present consent, was the Church trying to hold a line against families who would happily have married their children off at 5 if the sacrament allowed it. The canon lawyers kept restating that consent was everything precisely because they were staring at a society perfectly willing to manufacture consent from a child who didn't have it to give. The theology was, in a sense, permanently arguing with the practice. The Church built a beautiful principle of individual freedom and then spent centuries watching powerful families try to root around it, and its main weapon was the stubborn, repeated, sometimes honoured rule that when the child grew up, the child got to decide. There were limits even the medieval world observed, and they're worth naming so we don't overstate the horror. Betrothal was not consummation. The ages of consent existed specifically to keep actual marital relations from being licensed before puberty, and consummating a union with a child below the canonical age was condemned. The elaborate double-gate system, promise at 7, marry at 12 or 14, was itself a structure for delay, a way of prearranging the alliance while forbidding the marriage from being real, until the parties had at least reached the age the medieval world, rightly or wrongly, regarded as the border of adulthood. It is not a system any of us would defend, and its protections were often thin, unevenly enforced, and easily bent by families with power. But it's a more complicated picture than the Middle Ages married infants, and the complication is the interesting part. A society that genuinely traded children on the marriage market, restrained, imperfectly, grudgingly, but really, by a church that kept insisting those children would one day have to consent for themselves. What lingers, when you sit with all of it, is the sheer strangeness of a legal category that existed only to be grown out of. A childhood betrothal was a real, enforceable, court-recognised thing whose entire design anticipated the day the child might reach across the years and cancel it. The whole apparatus was built on a promise everyone knew the promiser hadn't really made, held together by the hope, or the fear, that they'd ratify it once they could. And every so often, in a church court in York or Chester, one of those grown children stood up and refused, and the same law that had let their parents pledge them at 7 turned around and let them go free at 12, which is either the cruelest or the kindest thing about the whole arrangement, and quite possibly both at once. Chapter 4. Bedding the couple. The vows were public, the money was public, the banns had been read to the whole parish. So of course, by the same logic, the wedding night was public too. This is the tradition that makes modern people wince the hardest, and I understand why. But stay with me, because the medieval reasoning is airtight once you accept its starting premises. After the feasting was done and the couple were as married as vows and mass could make them, the guests didn't say goodnight and go home. They escorted the newlyweds to the bedchamber, all of them. The whole boisterous, well-fed, frequently drunk wedding party processed up the stairs or through the house to the marriage bed, and they came in, and for a while they stayed. This was the bedding ceremony, the caucheur in French sources, and it was not a scandal or a prank. It was a recognised, expected, and often quite formal part of getting married. To understand why a crowd belonged in the bedroom, you have to remember what consummation actually did in medieval law, because it wasn't a private matter of feelings. Consummation had legal force. It converted a mere future promise into a full marriage. It was one of the facts that made a marriage complete and, crucially, hard to dissolve. It mattered to inheritance, to legitimacy, to dower rights, to any future dispute about whether this was a real marriage or an abandoned half-arrangement. And in a legal culture that ran on public witness rather than paperwork, the same culture that put the vows on the church porch so the neighbours could testify to them, it followed with grim consistency that the beginning of the marriage bed was something worth witnessing too. The community that had watched the vows now stood ready to attest that the couple had, at minimum, been put to bed together as man and wife. Your wedding night had an audience for the same reason your vows did, because in the Middle Ages a thing that happened in front of witnesses was a thing you could later prove. The ceremony itself had real structure, and it usually involved a priest, which surprises people. Before the couple were left, a blessing was pronounced over the marriage bed. The priest would come and bless the bed itself, the chamber, and the couple in it, sprinkling holy water, asking God to make the union fruitful, and to drive off whatever demons medieval theology assumed were hanging around any threshold where sex and reproduction were about to happen. There are blessings for the marriage bed preserved in the medieval service books, formal prayers over the thalamus, the bridal chamber, invoking the patriarchs and asking for many children. So the sequence went. The crowd brings the couple up, the priest blesses the bed, and only then does the party begin to think about clearing out. The wedding night opened with a liturgy, which is not the mood most modern couples are going for. The couple were often put into the bed together while people watched, and the details of this could get elaborate among the well-off. The bride would be undressed by her attendants, her mother, her sisters, her women, and the groom by his men, and both would be placed in the bed, sometimes propped up against the pillows, sometimes with the sheet drawn up, while the assembled guests looked on, offered toasts, made the kind of jokes you can imagine a room full of drunk relatives making at exactly this moment, and generally treated the whole thing as the raucous climax of the day's celebration. There might be a shared drink passed to the couple in the bed. There might be more blessing, more ribaldry, a last round of the coarse wedding humour that medieval people were not remotely too pious to enjoy. And then, this is the part that varied, at some point the crowd was supposed to leave, eventually. That, eventually, is where the truly funny and truly awkward variations lived, because the exit was negotiable. In the more restrained version, the couple were bedded, blessed, toasted, and then decently left alone, the crowd withdrawing to keep drinking elsewhere and let nature and the law take their course in private. But in other times, places, and social ranks, the witnessing went further, and there were customs, especially where a great deal of property or a dynasty hung on the outcome, in which the consummation itself, or at least its immediate aftermath, was treated as something the witnesses had a stake in confirming. The higher the stakes, the closer the scrutiny. A peasant couple were bedded with a blessing and a joke and left to it. A prince and princess whose union sealed a treaty and produced an heir who'd rule a kingdom might find the boundary between witnessed bedding and witnessed consummation uncomfortably thin, because the entire diplomatic point of the marriage rested on it being real. The evidence that mattered most in all of this was, frankly, the sheets, and I'm sorry, but this is genuine medieval and early modern practice. The blood-stained bridal sheet, proof, in the culture's understanding, that the bride had been a virgin and that consummation had occurred, was a real object of real evidentiary weight, sometimes displayed, sometimes kept, occasionally produced later, if anyone disputed whether the marriage had been consummated or whether the bride had come to it chaste. This custom stretches back into antiquity and persisted for centuries in various forms across Europe and the Mediterranean world, and it placed an enormous and deeply unfair burden on the bride, whose proof depended on a piece of anatomy that medieval and modern medicine alike know to be an unreliable witness. But the culture believed in the sheet, and belief was enough to make it matter. A great deal of a young woman's honour could hang on a stain that may or may not appear for reasons that had nothing to do with her chastity, which is a grotesque thing to build a reputation on, and they built reputations on it anyway. For the very highest marriages, the witnessing of consummation could become an affair of state, and the historical examples are almost unbelievable in their bureaucratic seriousness. When royal marriages needed to be proven consummated or proven not consummated, and both directions came up depending on whether someone wanted the marriage upheld or annulled, the wedding night could become the subject of formal testimony by attendants, ladies, and officials who had been positioned to know. The most famous English example comes just after our medieval window, in the annulment proceedings that swirled around Henry VIII, where the question of whether his brother Arthur had consummated his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, 2 teenagers, years earlier, became a matter of enormous political and theological consequence, argued over with witnesses testifying about what a boy had boasted the morning after and whether it meant anything. An entire nation's religious future turned, in part, on courtroom argument about a 15-year-old's wedding night. The bedding ceremony's logic, that the marriage bed was a matter of public record, reached its absurd apex when a wedding night became evidence in a case that split a church. Now, it would be easy to file all of this under pure prurience, medieval people being crude, but that misreads what was going on, and the misreading matters. The bedding was not fundamentally about voyeurism, even if plenty of voyeurism came along for the ride. It was about the same anxiety that shaped every part of medieval marriage, the terror of the unwitnessed, deniable, disputable union. A marriage that could be secretly contracted could be secretly abandoned. A consummation nobody saw could later be denied by a husband who wanted out, or disputed by a family who wanted the match annulled. The public bedding was the community's insurance policy against exactly that. By making the start of the marriage bed a witnessed event, medieval society tried to nail down one more slippery fact in a system where almost every important fact came down to somebody's word. The crowd in the bedroom was, believe it or not, part of the same evidentiary machine as the porch, the banns, and the ring, an attempt to make a private act publicly provable in a world with no cameras and no certificates. The blessing of the bed also carried a spiritual anxiety worth understanding, because the medieval bedroom was believed to be a genuinely dangerous place at that moment. Medieval theology had a fraught, guilt-tangled relationship with sex even inside marriage, permitted, sanctified for the purpose of children, but hedged about with rules and suspicion and a lingering conviction that the whole business was spiritually perilous. The wedding night, the very first act of marital sex, sat right on the fault line between sanctioned and sinful, and the culture believed that demons took a special interest in the threshold of reproduction. The famous story of the Book of Tobit, where the demon Asmodeus kills a woman's successive husbands on their wedding nights until Tobias drives him off with prayer and a bit of burning fish liver, was read at or around weddings precisely because it spoke to this fear. Blessing the bed was practical protection against a supernatural threat the couple genuinely believed in. The priest wasn't only asking for babies, he was warding off Asmodeus, and everyone in the room understood the assignment. There's a strand of the bedding custom that survived long past the era of drunk relatives in the bedchamber, and you almost certainly know its descendants without knowing where they came from. The garter, thrown or seized or fought over, is a direct relic. In some medieval and early modern versions, guests would grab at the bride's stockings and garters as tokens, so much so that brides took to throwing a garter to the scrambling crowd, partly to be left in one piece, and the young men who caught these tokens claimed them as lucky. The custom of guests carrying off bits of the bride, or racing to the marriage bed, or the newlyweds tossing something to a grabbing crowd to buy themselves peace. These are the ancestors of the garter toss, and, at a slant, the bouquet toss, the tamed and sanitized survivors of a night when the whole party genuinely expected to come upstairs with you. We kept the throwing and quietly forgot the escorting. The bedding ceremony faded as the porch wedding faded, as the whole medieval instinct to make private facts public slowly gave way to certificates and registers, and the modern conviction that the wedding night is nobody's business but the couple's. But it faded slowly, lingering in various European countries in softened forms for a very long time, the crowd shrinking to a few relatives, then to a ceremonial escort to the door, then to a joke, then to nothing but a thrown garter that nobody can explain. And I find something almost poignant under the awkwardness of it all. A whole community, having spent the day marrying two of its own, refusing to just abandon them at the bedroom door, insisting on walking them all the way to the threshold of the rest of their lives, blessing the bed, warding off the demon, and only then, reluctantly drink in hand, filing back downstairs to leave the newlyweds to the marriage the entire village had just watched them begin. Chapter 5. Proving it worked, and proving it didn't. If consummation was a legal fact, then the absence of consummation was a legal problem, and medieval courts, with their unshakable faith that anything could be established by proper procedure, set out to prove it one way or the other. This is where the whole apparatus we've been building tips over into something that reads like satire but is entirely real. The medieval impotence trial, in which a marriage could be dissolved on the grounds that the husband could not consummate it, and in which the church court would go to genuinely astonishing lengths to determine, as a matter of evidence, whether that was true. Because the church held marriage to be indissoluble. No divorce, in the modern sense, existed. The only exits were annulment, a ruling that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. And non-consummation, specifically incurable impotence existing at the time of the wedding, was one of the grounds that could void a marriage entirely. So a woman trapped in a marriage that could never be a real marriage had, in theory, a way out. She just had to prove it in court, in detail. The logic that got them there is worth spelling out, because it flows straight from everything we've covered. Marriage was for the union of two people, and, in the medieval understanding, for children. A man physically incapable of the marital act could not truly become one flesh with his wife, or fulfill the purpose of the sacrament. Therefore, a marriage that could never be consummated because of a defect present from the start was arguably no marriage at all. A hollow shell that the church could declare void, freeing both parties, and crucially freeing the woman to remarry someone who could give her children and a real union. It was, in its strange way, one of the few mechanisms medieval law offered a woman to escape a marriage, and women used it. The catch was the standard of proof, because the courts were not going to dissolve a sacred, supposedly permanent bond on somebody's mere say-so. They wanted evidence, and the evidence available for a question like this was, to put it mildly, intrusive. The first line of evidence was testimony, and the church courts assembled it with bureaucratic thoroughness. The wife would testify about the state of the marriage. Witnesses, servants, neighbours, family who shared the cramped quarters of a medieval household, and therefore knew far more about the couple's private life than anyone would today, would testify about what they'd observed, heard, or been told. There were even, in some cases, waiting periods. The couple might be ordered to live together and genuinely attempt consummation for a set stretch of time, often around 3 years, drawn from canon law's sense that you should give the marriage a real chance to work before declaring it hopeless. The court wanted to be sure this was incurable impotence and not a temporary difficulty, a passing illness, or a quarrel dressed up as a physical impossibility. So couples were sometimes sent back to try again, monitored and re-examined, the marriage placed in effect on probation, with the community watching to see whether nature would resolve the matter and spare everyone the next, more spectacular stage. Because when testimony wasn't enough, the courts turned to physical examination, and this is the part that has to be read to be believed. The most famous procedure, documented vividly in the 14th century records of the Church Court of York, that same extraordinary archive, involved the deployment of what the records call honest women, respectable married women, or sometimes prostitutes selected for their experience, appointed by the court to test the husband's capacity directly. In one celebrated York case from the 1370s, a group of these women was sent to examine a man named John, and their testimony survives, and it is exactly as blunt as you fear, and I will keep it as decorous as the material allows. They were tasked with attempting to arouse him, with warmth, with words, with their hands, with a full range of what the court delicately understood such an examination to require, and then reporting back, under oath, on the result. Their testimony, recorded by the court clerk in careful Latin, described in frank terms what they had attempted, and what had, or in this case had not, occurred, and concluded with the women's professional verdict on the man's capacity. A panel of women, appointed by a church court testifying about a specific man's specific performance, entered into the permanent legal record of the Diocese of York. The medieval marriage system, having decided that consummation was a provable fact, followed that premise all the way to its logical and deeply undignified end. The verdicts these women delivered could be crushing, and the language of at least one has survived the centuries because it is unforgettable. In the York record, the honest women's assessment of poor John, after their examination had failed to produce the required result, included a withering line to the effect that his member was no better than an empty piece of skin, useless, and that they cursed him for daring to have taken a wife when he was incapable of serving one. That contempt is doing legal work as much as emotional work. The women were testifying in the most vivid possible terms that this man could not consummate a marriage and had wronged his wife by pretending otherwise, and the court needed exactly that vividness to feel confident dissolving the bond. A modern courtroom would faint. The York Consistory wrote it down, filed it, and used it to set a woman free. And the trials cut both ways, which is the detail that saves this from being simply a catalogue of humiliation, because the accused men were not without recourse. A husband who did not want his marriage annulled, who disputed the charge of impotence, could contest it, could offer his own witnesses, could insist the fault lay elsewhere. There were cases where the wife alleged impotence and the husband furiously denied it, and the court had to weigh competing testimony about the most private facts imaginable. There were even accusations that ran the other direction, involving claims that a marriage's failure stemmed from the wife, or from bewitchment, or from some impediment neither party would admit to. The medieval world had a genuine and much feared category here: maleficium, the belief that a marriage could be rendered unconsummatable by witchcraft, by a curse tied literally in a knot. The nouement de l'aiguillette, the tying of the laces, a spell believed to knot up a man's virility. A husband could, in principle, defend himself by claiming his failure was the temporary work of a spell rather than a permanent defect of the body, which changed the legal calculus entirely, because a bewitched man might be cured and a naturally impotent one could not. Imagine the defence. Not that the accusation is false, but that it's true and it's a curse. That belief in bewitched impotence wasn't a fringe superstition. It was woven right through the culture's understanding of the wedding night, and it connects back to the demons we met blessing the bed. If demons and witches took a special interest in the threshold of reproduction, then a wedding night gone wrong might not be a medical fact but a spiritual attack, and the remedies were correspondingly spiritual. Prayers, blessings, pilgrimages, the counter-magic of untying what had been tied. This gave a failing couple somewhere to place the blame that wasn't the husband's body or the wife's honour, and it gave the community a story that fit its worldview. It also meant that an impotence case could tangle the church caught up in questions of witchcraft, curses, and the supernatural alongside the anatomical testimony of the honest women, the earthly and the demonic explanations sitting side by side in the same file, the clerk recording both with equal seriousness, because in the medieval mind both were entirely possible causes of the same unfortunate result. The gendered burden of all this ran, as it usually did, unevenly, and it's important to be honest about that. Impotence trials could genuinely help a woman. They were one of her few routes out of an intolerable marriage, and the honest women procedure at least put the question of capacity on the man's body rather than hers. But the broader machinery of proof bore down on women far harder in most respects. It was the bride whose virginity was tested by the sheet, the wife whose fertility was scrutinised, the woman whose body and honour were the default terrain on which the culture's anxieties about sex and legitimacy got fought out. The impotence trial is a striking exception precisely because it turned the evidentiary gaze onto the husband for once, which may be part of why the York case became so notorious, and why medieval people themselves clearly found it both scandalous and grimly funny. There is a reason the clerk recorded the honest women's curses in such loving detail. Somebody, 500 years ago, enjoyed writing that down. What holds the whole grotesque, fascinating business together is that same medieval conviction we keep running into, that the truth of a marriage was a public, provable, documentable thing, and that a court armed with witnesses and procedure could get to the bottom of any of it, no matter how intimate. The porch made the vows provable, the banns made the freedom to marry provable, the bedding made the consummation witnessable, and the impotence trial extended that same relentless logic into the one chamber you'd think even the Middle Ages might have left alone, insisting that whether a marriage had truly become a marriage was not a private mystery but a fact, and facts could be established if you were willing to appoint the right panel and write down what they found. It's easy to laugh at the honest women of York, and I do, warmly, but underneath the comedy is a legal system trying, with the crude and invasive tools it had, to give people trapped in impossible marriages a way out, and deciding, with a straight face and a Latin clerk, that the way out ran directly through the bedroom, under oath, with expert witnesses. Chapter 6. The bride price, the dowry, and the morning gift. Underneath every wedding we've watched so far, the porch vows, the endowment spoken over the ring, the bedding the whole village turned out for. There was money moving, and a great deal of it, in directions and amounts that a medieval family tracked with the cold attention it might otherwise give to a harvest. A marriage was a transfer of wealth as much as a union of persons, and the wealth flowed along channels with names, rules, and centuries of legal argument behind them. There were three great currents to keep straight, and medieval people kept them straight because getting them wrong could impoverish a widow or beggar an heir. The bride price paid by the groom's side, the dowry brought by the bride's, and the dower pledged by the groom for the wife's future. Add the morning gift on top, and you have the full financial architecture of a medieval wedding, which is to say, love conducted as a settlement, negotiated in advance, and enforced in court. The oldest of these currents ran from the groom's family toward the bride's, and it's the one that surprises people raised on the idea that a bride's family always paid. In the early medieval world, particularly among the Germanic peoples whose laws shaped so much of Northern Europe, the standard arrangement was bride price, the groom or his kin paying the bride's family for her. The early law codes are explicit about it. The Lex Salica of the Franks and the various other Germanic codes set out what a man owed to acquire a wife, and the sums were real, negotiated, and legally binding. The underlying idea was frankly transactional. A woman's labour, her fertility, and her place in her birth family had value, and the groom's side compensated for the loss of her. This is the world that gives us the very word wed, which comes from a Germanic root meaning a pledge, or the payment that sealed a bargain. To wed a woman was, etymologically, to pledge the payment for her. The romance of the word is a much later coat of paint over a foundation of hard currency. Over the medieval centuries the flow reversed, and understanding why tells you a lot about how the marriage market actually worked. Increasingly, dramatically so in the later Middle Ages, Above all, in the wealthy cities of Italy, the dominant payment became the dowry, brought by the bride's family to the marriage, given with her to her husband. The bride's side now paid to place her, and the sums ballooned into one of the defining financial pressures of medieval and Renaissance life. In 15th century Florence, the dowry inflation grew so severe that the city government created a public dowry fund, the Monte dei Dotti, in 1425, a state-run investment scheme where a father could deposit money when a daughter was small and collect a larger sum years later when she married, timed to mature exactly when he'd need to marry her off. A medieval city-state ran what amounted to a sovereign wealth fund for the express purpose of helping fathers afford to marry their daughters, because dowries had grown so ruinous that the marriage market threatened to seize up without one. That is how you know a custom has gotten out of hand. The government has to open a savings account for it. Why did dowries inflate so violently? The mechanics are almost brutally simple, and they're the mechanics of any competitive market. Where good husbands were scarce relative to the daughters competing for them, and in a world of dangerous male occupations, clerical celibacy, pulling men out of the marriage pool, and status-anxious families all chasing the same advantageous matches, the price of a good match rose, and it was the bride's family who paid it. A larger dowry bought a better husband, a higher-ranked family, a more secure future, and so families competed by offering more, and the whole thing ratcheted upward, each generation raising the bar for the next. Moralists complained. Fathers of many daughters despaired, because each one needed a dowry, and a family could be bled white marrying them all off. Some daughters, when the dowry simply couldn't be found, were placed in convents instead, for which, in a detail of perfect medieval irony, the family typically paid a smaller dowry to the nunnery, marrying the daughter to Christ at a discount because he charged less than a Florentine merchant's son. Now, the dowry did not simply vanish into the husband's pocket, and this is the crucial protective wrinkle that medieval law fought hard to preserve. The dowry was, in principle, the wife's, brought by her, meant to support her, and meant to return to her if the marriage ended. It was often described as belonging to the wife, even while the husband managed and used it during the marriage, and a great deal of medieval and Roman-derived law concerned the husband's obligation to preserve the dowry, and hand it back if his wife was widowed, or the marriage was dissolved. The dowry was a woman's security deposit on her own marriage, held by her husband but recoverable, the fund that was supposed to keep her from destitution if he died first. When it worked, and it often didn't, because husbands spent it, lost it, or died insolvent, it was one of the few real economic protections a married woman had, a piece of wealth that travelled with her and was, at least on parchment, hers. Facing the dowry from the other direction came the dower, and yes, the near-identical words are a genuine menace, so hold them apart carefully, because medieval widows' whole livelihoods hung on the distinction. The dowry came from the bride's family. The dower came from the groom, pledged to the bride as her provision if she outlived him. This is the "with all my worldly goods I thee endow" of the church porch made concrete. The husband setting aside a portion of his property, classically a third or sometimes a half of his lands, that his widow would hold for life after his death. English common law came to guarantee a widow a life interest in a third of her late husband's lands as her dower, whether or not it had been specifically pledged, and this dower right became one of the most robust protections a medieval woman possessed. It could not simply be sold out from under her. A widow with dower had land, income, and standing. The morbid arithmetic of it is real. A bride was, at the altar, provisioning for the day her husband died, and a wise family negotiated that provision hard because the marriage that began on the porch would, for one of them, end at a graveside, and the dower decided how the survivor lived afterward. And then, on the morning after the wedding night, came the loveliest sounding item on the invoice, and its timing tells you everything. The morning gift, the Morgengabe in the Germanic and German lands, a term that means exactly what it says, the morning gift, was a present given by the husband to his new wife on the morning after the marriage was consummated. It could be money, jewels, clothing, land, a house, sometimes a substantial estate, and it became the wife's own property, held and controlled by her in a way that much of the rest of the marital wealth was not. The medieval logic linking it to that specific morning is not subtle. The gift marked and rewarded the consummation, the completion of the marriage, the transition of the bride into a wife overnight. We are back, unavoidably, in the territory of everything the last 2 chapters covered. A marriage made real by consummation, a fact so freighted that it generated its own morning after gift. The Morgangabe was, at bottom, a payment keyed to the wedding night, dressed in the tender language of a present, and the bride kept it precisely because it was understood to be hers by right of what the night had accomplished. The morning gift had deep and telling origins, and among some peoples it began as something considerably less romantic than its name. In parts of the early Germanic and Nordic world, the morning gift is associated with the wife's status, and in some readings with her virginity or her transition into a legitimate wife, a gift that helped confirm her honourable standing and secured her own independent property within the marriage. Whatever its precise route, its function crystallised into a genuine protection, a fund that was unambiguously the wife's, that she controlled, that could support her, and that marked her as a full wife rather than a concubine or a woman of ambiguous status. Across the tangle of dowry and dower and bride price, payments that mostly flowed between families and were mostly controlled by men, the morning gift stands out as wealth that landed directly and durably in the woman's own hands, which is why it mattered so much and why the sources track it so carefully. It was, quite literally, what she woke up to. Step back and look at the whole ledger, and the shape of a medieval marriage as a financial instrument comes clear, with a beginning, a middle, and an end all provided for. Bride price or dowry moved at the front to seal the match and price the union. The dowry sat in the middle as the wife's security, managed by the husband but hers in principle. The dower waited at the far end as her provision for widowhood, and the morning gift dropped in on day one as her own outright property. Each piece answered a specific question the culture cared about intensely. What is this match worth? How is she protected during the marriage? How does she live if he dies? And what is hers alone from the start? It is a startlingly complete system, and it existed because marriage genuinely was, among everything else it was, an economic arrangement between families with real money and real futures at stake. An arrangement people fought over, litigated, defaulted on, and occasionally schemed to exploit exactly as people do with any large sum that changes hands. That litigation is not hypothetical, and the records are full of the wreckage, which is where the human comedy and tragedy of the money creeps back in. Church and secular courts alike heard endless disputes over unpaid dowries, withheld dowers, morning gifts a widow's in-laws refused to surrender, and the exact terms of endowment spoken years earlier on a church porch that everyone now remembered differently. A widow might sue for the dower her husband's heir was quietly withholding. A father might sue a son-in-law who'd pocketed the dowry and treated his daughter badly. A family might battle for years over whether a promised sum had ever actually been paid. The romantic surface of the wedding, the vows, the ring, the blessing, floated on top of a churning legal reality of installments, sureties, defaults, and lawsuits, and everyone involved knew it. When the wife of Bath bragged about her 5 husbands at the church door, part of what she was bragging about was that she'd survived 5 of these settlements and come out the other side with the property to show for it. She wasn't only counting husbands, she was counting the ledger. So when you next hear, with this ring I thee wed, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow, you might remember that the line is not, and never was, a poetic flourish. It is the fossil of a real financial declaration, the dower announced on the porch before witnesses who could enforce it, embedded so deeply in the ceremony that we now recite the terms of a medieval property settlement in our most romantic moment without hearing a word of what it's actually saying. The medieval wedding priced everything, the bride, the match, the widowhood, the morning after, and it wrote those prices into vows and gifts and gestures so enduring that we perform the accounting still, at the altar, in white, with tears in our eyes, quietly endowing each other with all our worldly goods and imagining it's only a metaphor. Chapter 7. Bans, bigamy, and the secret marriage problem. The church had a genuine horror running through everything we've discussed, and it's time to name it directly, because it drove one of the most enduring wedding customs of all. The terror that somewhere out there, the person standing at the altar was already married to somebody else. In a world where marriages could be contracted privately, by consent alone, with no register and no certificate, and no central record of any kind, the very loophole we opened this whole series with, how on earth was anyone supposed to know whether the man courting the miller's daughter had left a wife 3 villages over? He might have. People moved. People lied. and there was no office you could write to and no database you could check. So the church built the only tool available to a world without records. It made the community itself the database, and it did that through the reading of the banns. The banns were an announcement, and their mechanics were beautifully simple for a problem that had no simple solution. Before a couple could be married, their intention to marry had to be proclaimed publicly in church on 3 successive Sundays or holy days, the priest standing up before the assembled parish and naming the man and the woman who proposed to wed, and asking in the formula that still echoes faintly in wedding ceremonies today, whether anyone knew of any impediment, any reason these two could not lawfully marry. 3 separate Sundays, in the parishes of both parties if they came from different places, so that the largest possible number of people who might know something damning would have the chance to hear the names and speak up. This was formalised as a general requirement for the whole Western Church at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The same council we've kept returning to, the great tidying up of medieval marriage, which mandated the public announcement of intended marriages precisely so that impediments could surface before the wedding rather than after. And impediments were exactly what the banns were hunting for, because the list of things that could invalidate a medieval marriage was long, and the community was the only instrument sensitive enough to detect them. A prior marriage was the great one. An existing spouse made any new marriage bigamous and void. But the banns flushed out other impediments too. A forbidden degree of kinship between the couple, a prior betrothal to someone else, a vow of celibacy, a spiritual relationship through God-parenthood, and the whole tangle of other bars we'll get into next chapter. The theory was that in a face-to-face society where everyone knew everyone's business, if you announced a wedding loudly enough and often enough, someone in the pews would know the secret and be moved, by conscience, by malice, by a grudge, it didn't matter which, to stand up and derail it. The banns turned the entire congregation into a background check, run on gossip, powered by the fact that in a medieval village somebody always knew. The phrase that survives from all this is one you know cold, and its origins are grimmer than the weddings that use it. If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace, is the direct descendant of the banns. The moment for objection built right into the ceremony as a last chance after the 3 Sundays. In its original context, this was not a charming dramatic beat waiting for a jilted lover to burst through the doors. It was a serious legal invitation for anyone with knowledge of an impediment, most urgently a prior marriage, to halt the proceedings before an invalid and bigamous union was contracted before God. The line is a fossil of genuine legal function, a public call for evidence, preserved into an age that has certificates and registries and no earthly need for it, kept purely because it's dramatic. We turned a bigamy check into a suspense device. But here is where the whole elegant system runs headlong into the loophole that no council could close, and the collision is the heart of the chapter. The banns depended entirely on the wedding being public in the first place, and the church had already, fatally, conceded that a marriage did not have to be public to be valid. Consent alone made a marriage. So the clandestine marriage, the secret union contracted privately without banns, without a priest, without witnesses, remained fully valid even though it was completely illicit. And that meant the banns could be dodged with contemptuous ease by exactly the people most likely to have something to hide. The bigamist didn't stand up in church for 3 Sundays. He found a quiet room, said the present tense words to his new victim, and was, horrifyingly, as married to her, sacramentally, as he was to the wife he'd abandoned. The very people the banns were designed to catch had a standing, church-sanctioned way to avoid them, and they used it constantly. The result was a roaring medieval trade in clandestine marriages, and the court records document it in exhausting, fascinating detail. The consistory courts, York and Ely and Canterbury and their equivalents across Europe, are full of cases arising from secret unions, people who'd married clandestinely and now regretted it, people disputing whether a clandestine marriage had happened at all, and the nightmare scenario the whole system dreaded, people who had married publicly in church only for someone to emerge afterward, claiming a prior clandestine marriage to one of them that, if proven, voided the shiny public wedding entirely. That last situation was the stuff of genuine legal horror. A couple could do everything right, banns, porch, priest, mass, witnesses, the full public apparatus, and still have their marriage destroyed by a previously invisible private vow that one of them had spoken years earlier in a doorway, because the private vow, being valid, outranked the public wedding that came after it. The clandestine marriage was a legal landmine buried in someone's past, and it could detonate under a perfectly proper wedding at any time. The church loathed clandestine marriages with a real and consistent passion, and its position captured the whole absurd bind in a single stroke. It declared them valid but illicit. Valid, because consent made the sacrament and the church could not bring itself to deny its own theology. Illicit, because they violated every rule about bans and publicity and priestly presence, and so the church punished them, with fines, with penance, with censure for the priests who performed them and the couples who contracted them. You could be dragged before a court and disciplined for a marriage that the same court agreed was completely real and completely binding. The church spent centuries in this contradictory crouch, threatening people with punishment for doing something it simultaneously insisted had worked. It's the posture of an institution that has trapped itself with its own principle, and can't find the door, furious at the loophole, unable to close it, reduced to fining people for using the escape hatch it had built and blessed. The human cost of this fell, predictably and heavily, on women, and the pattern in the records is depressingly consistent. A clandestine marriage was the perfect instrument for a certain kind of man, and we met him back in the first chapter, the seducer who understood the machinery. Promise marriage privately, secure the consummation that converted the promise into a binding union in the woman's mind and in canon law, and then, when convenient, simply deny that any marriage had ever happened, knowing that a private vow with no witnesses was nearly impossible to prove. The woman would come to court insisting she was a wife, the man would swear she was nothing of the kind, and the court, faced with two contradictory accounts of an event that by design had no observers, would be left sifting scraps of circumstantial testimony to reconstruct whether a marriage existed at all. The same secrecy that let a bigamist take a second wife let a cadun make a first one, and in both directions it was usually the woman who was left holding the wreckage of a union she couldn't prove. Some clandestine marriages, though, were acts of genuine defiance rather than deceit, and this is the part that redeems the custom just a little and complicates the villainy. The clandestine marriage was also the only real weapon a couple had against families determined to control their match. Two people who loved each other and knew their parents would never approve could invoke the church's own radical principle, that their consent and no one else's made the marriage, and simply marry in secret, presenting the horrified families afterward with a done, valid, indissoluble fact. The very loophole that empowered bigamists and seducers also empowered lovers, and the same court records that show us abandoned women show us defiant couples who married against every wish of their kin and dared anyone to undo it. The clandestine marriage was a genuinely double-edged thing, a tool of exploitation and a tool of liberation, depending entirely on who was holding it and why. And the church, in trying to suppress it, was trying to close a door that some people were using to escape a fire. The whole tension we've traced across 7 chapters, radical private consent versus the desperate need for public order, finally broke in Catholic lands at the Council of Trent, and it's worth marking precisely how. The Decreta Metzi of 1563, which we glimpsed at the very start, at last declared that a marriage would only be valid if performed before the couple's parish priest and witnesses. This is the sentence that killed the clandestine marriage, not by punishing it, which had never worked, but by finally, after 4 centuries, declaring it invalid. From then on, in Catholic territories, the secret vow simply didn't count. The loophole was closed by fiat, the escape hatch welded shut, and marriage was dragged fully and permanently into the daylight of public ceremony. The bans had been trying to do that job since 1215, but the bans only worked on people willing to be seen. Trent worked on everyone, because it changed what a marriage was. It took the medieval church 400 years to admit that a rule it couldn't enforce needed to be replaced by a rule it could. But the bans themselves never died. They just outlived the emergency that created them and became a ritual. The 3 Sunday reading persisted for centuries, long after registers and certificates and civil records had made the community as database function largely obsolete. And the moment of objection, that call for anyone to speak now, survived right into the modern wedding, cut loose from its original purpose and preserved as pure theatre. And that, in the end, is the strange afterlife of the whole anxious medieval machinery. The terror of the secret spouse, the bigamist in the pew, the abandoned wife who couldn't prove her marriage, All of that hardened into a custom, and the custom outlived the fear, until we were left standing at altars solemnly asking a room full of people who've known the couple for years whether anyone objects, half hoping someone will, having entirely forgotten that the question was once a real and desperate attempt to find out whether the person you were about to marry already belonged to someone else. Chapter 8. Forbidden Degrees and the Cousin Calculus. Of all the things the bands were hunting for, one was so tangled, so far-reaching, and so genuinely difficult to calculate that medieval families sometimes needed expert help to figure out whether they were even allowed to marry at all. And that was consanguinity, the web of blood relationship that the church forbade couples to marry across. Every society has incest rules. That part isn't strange. What's strange, and gloriously so, is how absurdly wide the medieval church drew the circle. So wide that at its high water mark it forbade you to marry anyone related to you within 7 degrees of kinship, which in practice meant you were barred from marrying a 6th cousin, a person with whom you might share a single ancestor 5 or 6 generations back, a person you would almost certainly never be able to identify. The church didn't just bash marrying your sister, it banned marrying your great-great-great-great-grandfather's other descendants, all of them, a category that in a settled rural community could quietly include half the people you might ever meet. To grasp how this happened, you have to understand that the church changed the very method of counting, and the change is where the numbers exploded. The older Roman system of counting degrees of kinship walked up from one person to the common ancestor, and back down to the other, totting up every step along the way, so first cousins, sharing a grandparent, came out at the 4th degree by that reckoning. But medieval canon law adopted a different Germanic method that counted only the number of generations back to the common ancestor, taking the longer branch, which made first cousins merely the 2nd degree, siblings the 1st, and so on, compressing the whole scale so that a prohibition running to the 7th degree under this new counting reached back a staggering 7 generations. The same words, 7 degrees, meant something enormously more expansive under the new arithmetic, and this is the counting that prevailed from roughly the 11th century until the church finally lost its nerve about it. A change in bookkeeping method redrew the boundaries of who every person in Christendom was permitted to love. Even that is only the blood relationships, and the church, not content with forbidding half your cousins, kept inventing whole new categories of relatedness that carried the same marriage bar. There was affinity, relationship by marriage, so that your late wife's sister, your dead husband's brother, and a wide range of your in-laws became as forbidden to you as blood kin, on the theological principle that marriage made 2 people one flesh, and therefore fused their families into a single forbidden web. And then, most wonderfully, there was spiritual kinship, relationship created not by blood or marriage, but by the sacrament of baptism. Your godparents, your godchildren, and their close relations became your spiritual kin, and marrying across that spiritual bond was incest too, so that the man who stood as godfather to a child could be barred from later marrying that child, or the child's mother, or various of the child's relations purely on the strength of having held it at the font. The church had manufactured a form of relatedness out of a ritual, and then forbidden marriage across it, expanding the circle of the untouchable well beyond anyone you could possibly be related to by ordinary means. The practical consequence of all this, in a medieval village, was close to comic impossibility, and everyone involved knew it. Consider the reality. People mostly married locally, within a day's travel, drawing from a pool of a few surrounding villages whose families had been intermarrying for generations. In such a community, virtually everyone of marriageable age was related to virtually everyone else within 7 degrees somehow. By blood, by a marriage 2 generations back, or by the dense thicket of godparent bonds that tied the whole parish together. Taken literally, the rules would have made local marriage nearly impossible, forbidding almost every match a young person could actually arrange without walking to another county. The prohibition was so sweeping that in the ordinary run of village life it was essentially unfollowable, which meant that either the whole society was living in constant technical incest, or the rules were being quietly ignored, bent, and worked around all the time. It was of course the latter, but the fact that the rule existed and could be invoked mattered enormously, and here is where it gets clever and cynical at once. Because a rule this impossible to obey was a rule that could be selectively enforced, and the medieval world made a weapon of it. If almost every marriage technically violated the forbidden degrees somewhere, then almost every marriage was potentially voidable, and a couple, or a family, or a king who later wanted out of a marriage could go hunting through the genealogy for a previously ignored relationship that rendered the whole thing invalid from the start. This is the medieval annulment engine in its purest form. Since divorce did not exist, the way out of an unwanted marriage was to prove it had never been valid, and consanguinity was the great all-purpose tool for the job, because the net was cast so wide that a sufficiently motivated researcher could usually find a strand of forbidden kinship somewhere in the family tree. Marriages that had stood for years, produced children, and merged fortunes could be dissolved on the sudden discovery of a shared great-great-grandparent that everyone had known about all along, and no one had minded until the marriage soured. The impossible rule wasn't a bug the church tolerated. It was functionally a release valve for a system with no other exit. Kings naturally were the grand masters of this game, and the most famous case in medieval history shows exactly how it worked at the top. In 1152, Louis VII of France had his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine annulled, and the ground was consanguinity, the sudden official recognition that the royal couple were related within the forbidden degrees, a fact that had been perfectly discoverable throughout their 15-year marriage and had bothered no one while the marriage was useful. It became convenient once the marriage had failed to produce a son and the two had grown to loathe each other, and so the forbidden degrees machinery was cranked up and the union dissolved as if it had never been. Eleanor then promptly married Henry of Anjou, soon to be Henry II of England, to whom, in one of history's better jokes, she was even more closely related than she had been to Louis. The consanguinity rule was strict enough to end a marriage when the parties wanted it ended, and elastic enough to be ignored when they wanted a new one to begin. It was less a law than a lever, pulled when the powerful needed it, and left alone when they didn't. This, inevitably, produced an entire economy, because where there is an impossible rule and powerful people who need exceptions, there will be a market in exceptions. And the church, sitting on the authority to grant them, was perfectly positioned to run it. The mechanism was the dispensation, a formal grant of permission from ecclesiastical authority, ultimately the papacy, allowing a specific couple to marry despite a specific impediment of consanguinity or affinity that would otherwise have barred them. Need to marry your third cousin to keep the county's lands together? Apply for a dispensation. Want to cement an alliance by marrying into a family you're related to within the forbidden degrees? A dispensation could be arranged, and dispensations, especially the ones granted from Rome for the closer and more significant relationships, involved fees, favours, and the machinery of papal administration, which meant, in blunt terms, that the wealthy and well-connected could purchase their way through the very rules that constrained everyone else. The forbidden degrees fell hardest on the poor, who couldn't afford a dispensation, and had to either quietly ignore the rules or risk having a rival or an enemy denounce their marriage. The rich simply paid for permission and married whom they pleased. The dispensation trade tangled the church up in exactly the kind of worldly wheeling it was theoretically above, and everyone could see it. A wealthy family planning a strategic marriage between relatives would factor the dispensation into the negotiations the way they factored in the dowry. A cost of doing dynastic business, a line item, a thing you budgeted for. Papal dispensations for noble and royal marriages became a regular instrument of European high politics, granted, withheld, or delayed for reasons that were frequently as political as they were canonical, because the power to permit or forbid a marriage was the power to make or break an alliance, and the popes knew it. When a pope wanted to please a king, a dispensation for that king's desired marriage flowed smoothly. When a pope wanted to obstruct one, the same request could bog down in doubts and delays for years. The forbidden degrees, born as a rule about incest, had grown into an instrument of diplomacy and revenue, and the gap between the pious theory and the transactional practice was wide enough to drive a wedding procession through. The church itself eventually recognized that the rules had metastasized into unworkability, and in a rare moment of institutional self-awareness it pruned them back. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, that great council again, doing so much of the work of dragging medieval marriage towards sense, the prohibited degrees of consanguinity and affinity were reduced from 7 to 4. From then on the bar extended to the 4th degree, meaning third cousins, which was still remarkably wide by modern standards, but a dramatic retreat from the 6th cousin absurdity that had preceded it. The council's own reasoning was refreshingly frank. The wider prohibition had proven impossible to observe and impossible to prove, since almost no one could actually trace their kinship out to 7 degrees reliably, and a rule that could not be observed or verified served mainly to trap people and generate litigation. It was, in effect, the Church admitting that it had drawn the circle too wide to mean anything, and pulling it into a size that human beings could at least theoretically respect. But 4 degrees was still generous enough to keep the annulment engine and the dispensation economy humming for centuries more, and the underlying logic never really changed. Third cousins were still forbidden without a dispensation. In-laws were still snared by affinity. Godparents were still caught by spiritual kinship. And the net remained wide enough that a determined party could usually find grounds to void a marriage, or a determined family could usually find an impediment requiring a purchasable exception. The reduction made the system marginally more livable without dismantling its essential character as a set of rules broad enough to catch almost anyone and flexible enough to be waived for the right price or the right politics. And the deepest irony sat right at the centre of it all unresolved. This was the same Church that had staked everything on the radical principle that 2 people's free consent and nothing else made a marriage, and it had wrapped that principle in a genealogical thicket so dense that the couple's consent could be perfectly free, perfectly public, perfectly witnessed, and still void because 5 generations back they'd shared a great-great-great-grandparent that a clever enemy managed to dig up. You were free to marry whomever you chose, the Church said, provided you could first prove, across 7 generations of half-remembered village genealogy, that whomever you chose wasn't secretly your cousin. Chapter 9. Charivari. When the village disapproved. So far the community has been the audience and the witness, the crowd on the porch, the neighbours testifying in court, the parish listening to the banns. But the community was also a critic, and when it disapproved of a marriage, it had a way of saying so that was loud, organised, humiliating, and armed with kitchenware. This is the Charivari, the French name that travelled furthest, though the English called it rough music, the Italian scampanata, the Germans Katzenmusik, cat music, and the Welsh and various regions had their own local names for the same essential ritual. It was the practice of a crowd gathering outside the home of a couple who had offended the community's sense of how marriage ought to work, and subjecting them to a night, or several nights, of deliberate, coordinated, ear-splitting cacophony, mockery, and public shaming. The village had opinions about your wedding, and if it didn't like your choices, it came to your window and made those opinions unbearable. The instruments of the Charivari were whatever made a hideous noise, and the sources delight in listing them because the whole point was ugliness. Pots banged with spoons, pans and kettles beaten together, cowbells, horns, whistles, rattles, drums, the clashing of metal on metal, shouting, jeering, mock songs, and the general production of the most discordant racket a crowd could sustain. This wasn't music that had gone wrong, it was anti-music, produced on purpose, the sonic opposite of the harmony a wedding was supposed to represent. The rough music was rough by design, a wall of noise meant to invert the celebration, to replace the joyful bells and songs of a proper wedding with a mocking, grating parody of them. And it went on. A Charivari might return night after night, denying the couple sleep and peace, a siege of noise that continued until the crowd was satisfied, or paid off, or the humiliation was judged complete. The neighbours weren't serenading the marriage, they were heckling it, in shifts. The crucial thing to understand is that the Charivari was not random cruelty. It was targeted, and it targeted specific kinds of marriages the community regarded as wrong, unnatural, or a threat to the proper order of things. The classic trigger was a mismatch of age, above all the marriage of an old man to a young woman, or an old widow to a young man, unions the community read as greedy, ridiculous, and disruptive, an old person hoarding a young spouse who ought by rights to have gone to one of the village's own eligible youths. There was real social logic underneath the mockery, and it's worth seeing clearly. In a community with a limited pool of marriageable young people, an old widower marrying a young bride removed her from that pool and was seen as unfair to the young men denied her, and vice versa. The Charivari expressed the community's economic and demographic resentment through the language of ridicule, punishing the disruption of the marriage market with a night of pots and pans. The remarriage of widows and widowers was another great trigger, and here the ritual reveals its emotional and even quasi-supernatural dimensions. A widow or widower who remarried especially one who did so quickly, before a decent interval of mourning had passed, or who married someone much younger, was a frequent target, because the community felt the new marriage disrespected the dead spouse and disturbed the proper order of grief and inheritance. There was an old, deep unease about second marriages knitted into a lot of this, a sense that the first marriage's bond lingered, that the dead had claims, that hurrying into a new bed while the old spouse was barely cold was an offence against something more than mere manners. The rough music that greeted a hasty remarriage carried an undertone of that unease, the living reminding the remarrying widow or widower, and perhaps the restless dead, that the community had noticed and did not approve. It was social policing, and a kind of folk spiritual protest braided together into the same clanging night. The charivari also had a repertoire of humiliations beyond noise, and some of them were genuinely elaborate pieces of street theatre. There might be a mocking procession, an effigy of the offending party paraded through the village and then abused or burned. There might be crude songs composed specially for the occasion, cataloguing the couple's offences in verse for maximum public embarrassment. There might be a figure made to ride backward on a donkey or an ass, a classic gesture of inversion and shame, the wrong-way-round rider signalling a wrong-way-round marriage. In some versions, a neighbour or a hired stand-in would be forced or persuaded to represent the shamed party, riding the donkey or wearing horns or otherwise embodying the community's mockery. The whole vocabulary of the charivari was the vocabulary of inversion. Backward riding, anti-music, parody weddings, the world turned upside down, because a marriage the community deemed unnatural was answered with a ritual that turned everything the right way of doing things stood for exactly on its head. Cuckoldry and disordered households drew the rough music too, and this is where it strayed into policing the internal life of a marriage rather than just its formation. A husband believed to be dominated or beaten by his wife, a wife believed to be unfaithful, a household where the community judged the proper hierarchy to be inverted. These could all summon a charivari, the crowd arriving to shame a marriage that had violated not the rules of who could wed whom, but the rules of how a marriage ought to be conducted. In parts of England and France, the man perceived to be under his wife's thumb, or a neighbour standing in for him, might be the one set backward on the donkey, horns fixed to his head, paraded as a warning to every other husband about the shame of a household out of order. The charivari in this mode was the community enforcing its vision of marriage from the inside. Not content with policing the wedding, it reserved the right to police the marriage for as long as it lasted, and to show up with cookware whenever it decided the couple had gotten it wrong. There was frequently a transactional edge to the whole performance, which pulls it back from pure menace towards something almost like a shakedown, and this is one of its stranger features. In many places the charivari could be ended by payment. The couple, to buy peace and silence, would hand over money or, more often, drink, and the crowd would accept the tribute, toast the very marriage they'd been mocking, and disperse. This gave the ritual an almost commercial rhythm. The noise was partly a demand, the disruption partly a negotiation, and the couple's contribution a kind of entry fee for rejoining the community's good graces. A canny couple who knew a charivari was likely, an old man marrying a young bride would hardly be surprised, might have the wine ready, treating the rough music as a toll to be paid rather than a catastrophe to be endured. The village extracted its due, the couple bought their peace, and everyone understood the transaction, which lends the whole thing the flavour of a rowdy, ritualised fine collected in beer. Underneath the noise and the donkeys, the charivari was performing a real and recognisable social function, and historians have taken it very seriously precisely because of what it reveals. This was community self-regulation, in a world with little formal machinery for enforcing social norms about marriage. The state was distant, the church policed the rules of validity but not the community's sense of fitness, and so the neighbours took it upon themselves to enforce the unwritten code, the sense of who ought to marry whom, of what respect the dead were owed, of how the marriage market should distribute the young, of how a proper household should be ordered. The charivari was the community's voice made deafening, an informal court of public opinion that issued its verdicts in pots and pans rather than parchment, and its sentences in sleepless, mortifying nights. It was rough, sometimes genuinely cruel, occasionally a cover for score settling and bullying, but it was also a coherent expression of a community's shared convictions about marriage, delivered by the only enforcement arm that community had, which was itself. The authorities had a complicated relationship with all this, veering between tolerance and alarm, and the tension is telling. On one hand, the Charivari enforced a broadly conservative social order, punishing mismatches, policing hasty remarriage, shaming disordered households, which aligned neatly enough with what church and state also wanted. On the other, it was a crowd, unsanctioned, self-appointed, capable of tipping from ritual mockery into real violence, riot and extortion. And both church and secular authorities periodically tried to suppress or restrain it precisely because a mob enforcing its own idea of justice is a mob that might decide to enforce other things too. Ecclesiastical authorities condemned the Charivari at various points. Secular ones tried to regulate or ban the more violent forms. But it proved extraordinarily durable, persisting in various guises across Europe for centuries, surviving every condemnation, because it answered a need no official institution filled. The community's need to say, collectively and unmistakably, "We do not approve of this marriage," in a voice too loud to ignore. And the Charivari did not stay in the Middle Ages. It followed Europeans across oceans and down the centuries, softening as it went, until its descendants turn up in places you'd never connect to a medieval mob with cowbells. The chivalry of rural North America, a word that is simply Charivari worn down by English mouths, survived into the 20th century as a custom where friends and neighbours would descend on newlyweds with noise and pranks on their wedding night, banging pots, ringing bells, demanding treats, keeping the couple up. By then most of the menace had drained out of it, and the sharp edge of moral judgment had dulled into rowdy good-natured teasing, a bit of communal roughhousing rather than a sentence of shame. But the bones were medieval. The crowd at the newlywed's door, the deliberate racket, the demand for drink or treats to buy peace, the community insisting on one last loud word about a marriage it had opinions about. The clanging pots followed the settlers to the frontier, and the frontier past them, quieter now, all the way down to us. You can still hear the faintest ghost of the Charivari today, if you know what you're listening for, in the honking convoy of cars that trails a wedding party through town, horns blaring, cans tied to the bumper rattling along the asphalt. That noise is the last, cheerful, fully declawed descendant of the rough music, a crowd making a deliberate racket around a marriage, the way crowds have done for the better part of 1,000 years, except that where the medieval village banged its pots to condemn, the modern one honks to celebrate. The judgment has drained away and left only the noise, but the impulse underneath is the same ancient one that sent the neighbours to the old man's window with their kettles and their backward donkey. The deep, communal conviction that a marriage is never entirely private, that the village always has an opinion, and that it is entitled, whether in fury or in joy, to show up at the door and make itself heard. Chapter 10. Feasting, Flowers, and the Things We Kept. The final one, with the sign-off. We've spent 9 chapters on the strange machinery of the medieval wedding. The porch, the bedding, the honest women, the forbidden cousins, the pots and pans at the window. And now, at the end, comes the part everyone actually looked forward to, the feast. Because after the vows and the mass and the negotiations, a medieval wedding meant food and drink and celebration on a scale a village might not see again for years, sometimes stretched across multiple days, and paid for with a lavishness that could genuinely dent a family's fortunes. This was the joyful public face of everything else we've discussed, the communal blowout that turned a legal and sacramental transaction into a party, and it mattered enormously, because a wedding feast was where the marriage was celebrated before the whole community, where the two families performed their new alliance in the universal language of feeding people until they couldn't move. The scale of a great medieval wedding feast is hard to overstate, and the surviving accounts read like a delirium of consumption. At the top of society, these were events of staggering excess, feasts running for days, with hundreds or even thousands of guests, and food in quantities that beg a belief. The wedding of a great noble or a royal could involve whole roasted oxen, dozens of swans and peacocks dressed and refeathered to be presented as if alive, mountains of venison and game and fish, elaborate spiced dishes, and the theatrical centerpieces medieval cooks adored, the subtleties, sculpted showpieces of sugar, marzipan and pastry shaped into castles, beasts, coats of arms, and allegorical scenes, paraded between courses purely to astonish. Course after course, sometimes many courses, each announced and presented with ceremony, the whole meal functioning as a display of the host family's wealth and status as much as a means of feeding anyone. The feast was a performance of prosperity, and the message it sent to every guest was unmistakable. Look what this alliance can afford. Even far below the level of oxen and refeathered peacocks, ordinary weddings strained toward the same excess, and this is precisely what got the authorities worried. A peasant or village wedding was still, by the standards of ordinary life, a feast of extraordinary abundance. Meat when meat was rare, ale flowing freely, bread and dishes and treats laid on for a crowd of relatives, neighbours and hangers-on. Families spent heavily, sometimes ruinously, to host a wedding that reflected well on them, because the shame of a poor showing was real and lasting in a community that would remember it for a generation. And this competitive spending, this arms race of hospitality, where each family tried to match or outdo the last wedding the village had seen, is exactly the kind of thing that made medieval and early modern governments reach for one of their favourite and most futile tools, the sumptuary law. Sumptuary laws were regulations that tried to cap consumption and display, and weddings, as engines of exactly the runaway spending these laws targeted, were a frequent object of them. Across medieval and Renaissance Europe, towns and rulers passed ordinances limiting how much a wedding could cost, how many guests could be invited, how many courses could be served, what could be worn, and how much could be spent on the whole affair. Italian cities were especially fond of this, legislating in remarkable detail the permissible scale of a wedding celebration, the number of guests, the value of the bride's clothing and jewels, the extent of the feast. The stated motives were a mix of the moral and the practical, curbing sinful excess and vanity, preventing families from bankrupting themselves, keeping the lower orders from aping their betters, and dampening the competitive spending that could destabilize a family's finances and a community's sense of proper hierarchy. A wedding that outshone your station was a wedding that offended the social order, and the law stepped in to keep celebration within its assigned bounds. The laws did not work, and their failure is one of the more comic running themes of pre-modern social history, because they were fighting human nature and losing. People wanted to celebrate their weddings lavishly. Families wanted to display their status and their joy, and no ordinance capping the guest list at some official number could withstand the universal urge to throw the biggest party you could afford and invite everyone you knew. Sumptuary laws were passed, ignored, repassed with sterner language, ignored again, and reissued for centuries in a cycle that testifies mainly to their complete ineffectiveness. The same limits legislated over and over precisely because nobody obeyed them the first dozen times. The very persistence of the laws is the proof of their failure. If people had actually restrained their wedding feasts, the authorities wouldn't have needed to keep passing the same laws generation after generation, growing more exasperated with each reissue, forever trying and forever failing to make weddings smaller than the people throwing them wanted them to be. Amid the feasting sat a scattering of smaller customs that we can follow directly into the present, and the wedding cake's ancestors are among the most charming. There's a well-known tradition, attested in England, of guests bringing small spiced buns or cakes that were piled into a great heap on a table, and the couple would attempt to kiss over the top of the mound. The higher the pile, the more prosperity the marriage was promised, and success in kissing over it without toppling the tower was a good omen. Whether or not every detail of the story is embroidered, the deep pattern is real. Sweet baked goods, stacked and shared, blessing a marriage with sweetness and plenty, an ancestor of the towering tiered wedding cake we still cut today. And there was the breaking or crumbling of bread or cake over the bride's head in some traditions, a gesture of fertility and abundance showering her with the crumbs of prosperity. A distant cousin of throwing things at brides that runs by a winding path, all the way to the confetti and the tossed rice and the flung grain that greeted couples across so much of the pre-modern world. All of it the same wish for fruitfulness hurled in edible or symbolic form. Flowers and greenery threaded through the medieval wedding too, and the bride's crown deserves special mention because it upends what we assume about wedding day white. The bride did not, in the Middle Ages, characteristically wear white. That convention is overwhelmingly a much later development, popularised in the 19th century and cemented in the popular imagination by Queen Victoria's white wedding dress in 1840. The medieval bride wore her finest clothing in whatever colour suited her, means and taste, rich blues, reds, greens, cloth of gold if she could afford it, the brightest and most costly garments she could manage, because the point was to look wealthy and beautiful, not virginal in white. What she often did wear was her hair loose and unbound, a mark of maidenhood permitted on the wedding day, sometimes crowned with a chaplet or garland of flowers and herbs, and the herbs and flowers chosen carried meanings, wishes for fidelity, fertility and protection, woven into a crown for a girl wearing her hair down for one of the last times before a wife's covered head became her lot. The whole picture is nearly the inverse of the modern one: bright colours, flowing hair, a crown of meaningful greenery, and not a scrap of ceremonial white in sight. The ring we've already met on the porch, riding the false vein of love to the fourth finger, and the veil has its own long and tangled ancestry, reaching back past the Middle Ages into Roman and older practice. The covering of the bride carrying associations of modesty, of protection, of the transition from one state to another, of the set-apart sacredness of the bridal moment. These are the fragments that survived: the ring, the veil, the flowers, the cake, the thrown grain, the vows themselves, the speak now, the very idea of standing before a gathered community to be married. We have carried an astonishing amount of the medieval wedding forward with us, mostly without any idea of what we're carrying, reciting property law as romance, performing a bigamy check as suspense, throwing a garter descended from a night when the whole village came upstairs, cutting a cake descended from a pile of buns kissed over for luck. The medieval wedding didn't end. It went quiet, shed its origins, and hid inside our own ceremonies, where we reenact it faithfully every June without knowing a single thing about where any of it came from. And that, more than anything, is what I hope stays with you as the fire burns down tonight. Not the strangeness of these people, but the closeness of them. It would be easy, across 10 chapters of honest women and backward donkeys and cousins forbidden to the 7th degree, to come away feeling how impossibly far away the medieval world is, how alien its assumptions, how bizarre its customs, and some of it truly is far away, and some of it was genuinely cruel, and I've tried not to flinch from that. But look at what we kept. We kept the ring on the wrong finger, the vows about worldly goods, the moment where anyone may object, the flowers, the cake, the noise outside the church, the whole apparatus of gathering a community to witness two people binding their lives together. These weren't faceless figures in a tapestry doing incomprehensible things. They were people trying to do the same enormous, terrifying, hopeful thing we still try to do, to promise a whole future to another person and get the world to take the promise seriously. And they built strange and beautiful and sometimes ridiculous machinery to make that promise stick, and we are still living inside the machinery they built. So thank you for spending this long, quiet while here with me, wherever you are and whatever hour it's gotten to be on your side of the window. If you drifted off somewhere back around the honest women of York, that's all right. That's rather the idea, and the chapters will keep until you're rested. If you're still awake, I hope the house is warm and the day behind you is finished and forgivable. This is a sleep channel, and I'm not going to ask anything more of you tonight than that you let your shoulders down and let the fire settle. If you've enjoyed the company, you know where the buttons are, and there'll be another long, strange history waiting whenever the next sleepless night finds you. Until then, from all these married and buried and remembered people, and from me, rest well and good night.